Hey everybody, it's Steph Mishchuk. So in this vlog, I want to talk about changing technology. So this is kind of in response to the response I got from a vlog I did on why I would not get into Ruby on Rails today. And let me just point out, this is not an attack on Ruby on Rails technology per se. It's very good. You can do a lot with it. My main point was the business end of it. You have on one side, you have Python Django putting pressure on Rails, pushing down Rails. And on the other side, you have PHP 7 with probably the most popular PHP framework today, which is Laravel, putting pressure on Rails. Now, the thing about Laravel, they borrowed a lot of ideas from Rails, and I'm sure Django did as well, although I haven't looked at Django in many years, so I can't comment on that. So you have Django on one side with Python. Now Python's very similar to Ruby in many respects, although the Ruby guys would argue with the Python guys, but they're very similar in many respects, and they're both very cool languages. The problem for Ruby, though, is Ruby, as far as I can see, is pretty much in the web space. You want to do web apps. Whereas what you got with Django, with Python, not only can you do the a web app with it using, of course, Django, and there's another framework which I forget off the top of my head, but it's actually used quite a bit in other areas as well. Python is, IoT, Internet of Things. Apparently, Python is used a lot there. Python is eating Ruby's lunch on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have PHP 7 and Laravel, or PHP Cake, or Symfony, and it's eating Ruby and Rails breakfast on the other end of the spectrum. PHP is holding solid, and again, PHP has got this user base which is massive, and it's got these signature apps like Facebook, and it's got these all two important apps in real world web development. WordPress is number one, which is built with PHP and Joomla and Drupal. You may not want to do that kind of work, and that's cool. But again, I'm not criticizing Rails per se. I'm just saying that it's getting a lot of pressure and starting to fade. And I have seen this several times before, and it's just the way it goes. And as a developer, you got to recognize that this happens once every 5 or so years. You see a big shift in technology. So I started coding in 1994, and in the mid 90s, in terms of client-side front-end development, it was HTML, and it was table-based design. You guys probably not aware of this. Then came around 2000, so 5 years later. In 2000, you had the rise of the web standards movement, where CSS-based layout started to take hold, and that basically just wiped out table-based layout within a couple of years, 2-3 years. So there's this big shift. So all the table-based designers, web page designers, and all that whole process of developing web apps back in those days was lost, was gone. And in fact, I had an old friend of mine who was one of the pioneers in the web business back in the day, and he sort of got out of it in 98 or something, 99, sort of stepped away, 98. And he came back in 2003, and he was astounded at how different it was. In fact, he said to me, I remember clearly, he said, I'm going to have to relearn this stuff all over again from scratch, because web design and development had totally changed in just that short period of time. It was pretty amazing. And I've seen this time and time again, like in the early 90s, the way you would build dynamic web apps, it would be CGI based. It would be Perl CGI. Well, that was the most, Perl CGI or C, or down to C code. And the way that would work, you would embed your view code, your HTML, inside of your code. So if you wrote your stuff in Perl, your HTML code was mixed in like print statements inside of the Perl, which is, anybody knows that's a terrible thing to do. It's what a pain in the butt. And that went on for a few years. And then the page-based paradigm came out. The first one I'm aware of is ASP Classic. Microsoft put that out, and that's where I cut a lot of my teeth in my first web app creation. ASP came out, I think it was 96. I started using it then. And that sort of flipped it on its head, where we, instead of embedding view code inside of our code, inside of our programming language, we would embed the coding language inside of our view code. So we'd have pages, instead of HTML pages, you have .asp pages. And you put our programmatic code inside of the views. And that has its own problems, but there's ways to handle that, and I'm not going to get into that. And then, of course, Java took that on as well. It went from servlet-based only, where you had your view code inside of your Java code, where then they had the JSP, which was just a copy of ASP. And it progressed from there. And Rails came out. It hit its peak, I think, in about 2007, from fast forwarding several years. And you had like, it represented, I think, the best refinement of the monolithic framework. And you had many frameworks before, web objects. In the Java world, you have web objects, which is Apple's thing. You had struts, Java struts, and Velocity, which was a template engine, is Java Tapestry, another engine, and there are many, many, many others of these frameworks, and they each had their own approach and so forth. But Rails, I think, really set the bar and really helped pull the web development community forward. But now we're in 2016, and now we're starting to see the move into microservices, which is, I guess, an extension of distributed application development. But again, it's another push, and now we're seeing another paradigm shift. Now, my comment about that, and I've talked about microservices in another video, which you can find in this collection. That being said, I don't believe in the microservice-only application. I think that you should still have your core framework, whether it be Rails or Django or Laravel or Spring, but then Java Spring. But then what you should have is use microservices to support your main framework. But anyway, that's beyond the scope of this particular vlog. The whole point of this vlog, at the end of the day, is that you have to recognize as a coder is that these are all tools, whether it be Ruby and Rails, whether it be Python, Django, whether it be PHP 7, Laravel, Java Spring, doesn't matter. They're just tools. And it's kind of funny for me how people get emotionally involved with their tools. You know, Rails people, they get pretty angry if you suggest that Rails is fading. We're not saying Rails sucks, we're just saying it's fading. And you look at the data, it's empirical data, it is fading. And if you look at the underlying trends, you can see why it's fading. I talked about it. Python's eating its lunch on one end, and PHP 7 is eating its lunch on the other end. Then you have JavaScript. JavaScript is coming up fast, you know. So, you know, Rails, you know, had its peak literally in about 2007, 2008, and it's been on a slide ever since. And I've seen that before. I've seen it with Perl CGI. Remember the Perl CGI guys? They were dominant for a few years. And they said, no, Perl, it's Perl. And then ASP came around. ASP just took care of it. And ASPs and JSP, Java, just, you know, Perl, you still see a few Perl web apps out there. And the Perl people, there's still hardcore Perl people out there, but it's really become a niche thing. And you see that with several other technologies I've seen over the years. VB, classic VB, Flash. You saw Flash got killed recently, just in the last, 2007, I think it was, that Steve Jobs decided to take out Flash. So these things happen. So the good thing in terms of being a developer is that things have really standardized relative to the past. You're not going to be like my buddy who woke up 4 years later to find that everything he knew about web design had changed, or much of it. It's really stabilized now more than I've ever seen before. Meaning, you know, Rails sort of hit a level, and now everything is in the same realm. So if you're coming from Ruby on Rails and you move into, heaven forbid, PHP 7 Laravel or Python Django, it won't be a big deal for you, because you will have, you already understand the basic structure of these type of apps, and how it all works. And you know your basic design patterns, MVC, you understand refactoring, you understand filter patterns and all this kind of stuff. It will be easy for you to jump from Rails, Ruby Rails to Python Django or to PHP Laravel. You know what I mean? So I wouldn't get caught up in that. Again, I don't know if a plumber would get really angry if somebody suggests that they use a Wilson wrench and then a Black & Decker wrench or something. Whatever, Doesn't matter. Don't get caught up with it. Again, I keep stressing this. The most important thing for developers is to master the basics. The basics, the basics, the basics. Basic design patterns, basic refactoring, basic good coding practices and structure. And just, a good understanding of object orientation and how to properly write code. This is universal. These are some universal principles that translate across all technologies. And the longevity in what you do comes to that. So this is a pretty long blog. I'm just checking my time, 11 minutes. But you know what? I'm going to go on a bit longer. So let me give you an example. I was, in the late 90s, I became a big Java zealot. Everything I did was Java. Java was the king. I loved Java. I wrote everything in Java. And server-side Java. Now, I didn't use one of the big frameworks because I thought they were too heavy. I used a lightweight MVC framework I developed myself, something that we called Pojo-based. Basically, very fine-grained micro objects, if you will. And that's how I had my framework, and I was doing very well with that. But what started to happen as I got more and more gigs coming at me, people would come to me and say, we want to build it in this language. We want it in PHP, or we want it in this, or we want it in that. And I used to fight them and said, no, we're going to do it in Java. Everything was a nail because I had my Java hammer, right? But then I came to a client one time and they insisted that I updated their site, which was built on PHP. They insisted that I do it on PHP. And you got to understand, this is not PHP today, where you have namespaces and it's properly object-oriented, and it has proper error trapping. Like back in those days, this is pre-PHP 4 even. PHP 4, you probably don't know. That's when they started sort of becoming object-oriented, or maybe it was PHP 4. But anyway, it was broken relative to Java. There was no proper error trapping. It was really terrible, and I was gagging writing this code. It was ugly looking code too. But the client insisted. I said, whatever, they're paying me. So I just learned it. And after the 2 or 3 hours of disgust, I said, it's doing the job. It's working. It's easy. And then I started seeing, even though in its primitive state relative to Java, it was very lightweight. To give you an example, if I wanted to send an email with Java servlets, back in those days, it was like a page of code, right? Now the PHP, for all its flaws, it was one line of code to send an email. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't elegant. Rather, it was, but it did the job. And I remember my brother, who was a big Java coder, he was like shaming me. I was like, "What are you doing?" And I said to him, "You know what? Yeah, PHP, it sucks in a lot of different ways back then. But it's whatever. You know what? I can write this thing in 200 lines of code instead of 10,000 lines of code. So yeah, doesn't have good debugging, doesn't have proper error trapping. I just use a die statement. It's kind of very primitive. But you know what? It's a lot easier to debug 200 lines of code than 10,000 lines. I remember saying that to him. He said, yeah, that's a good point. So whatever. Yeah, wasn't great. But the app worked, and it worked for years. So then I started approaching projects more and more like that. I started saying, let's sit in with the client. I go in with the client. I say, okay, what do you got to do? And I would pick the technology best for them. Sometimes it would be Java. I push for Java. Sometimes it would be PHP. Sometimes it would be something strange. Like I did some early apps for, I think it was Merck Frost, big pharmaceutical. It was either Merck Frost or it was the other one. And I did it with something called an HTA, which was an early version of a client-side app using client-side technology. So basically, writing with, I think it was JavaScript code, I was talking to Windows COM objects, calling Windows COM to generate PowerPoint slides and stuff. And this is back in the day because for their particular needs, it was easier for me to do it this way than to try to write a Java client, for instance, or maybe a VB client or something, and so on and so forth. I got approached by another pharmaceutical to build my very first actually educational app. It was like 2000. And it was an educational app for medical doctors. It was video-based with quizzing and tracking and stuff. And what did I do it in? Java, my favorite language? No, I did it in something like one of the worst languages I've ever seen, something called Lingo, which was a language, an app scripting language built in for a director, something called Director, Adobe Director. This is during the time of DVDs. This thing had to be delivered on DVDs because the web was sketchy in those days. So I did it in something called Lingo inside of Director. And let me tell you, you think this is one of these languages. They tried to hide coding from the coders, and then they tried to add coding on top of it. It was like extremely verbose. Wasn't fun. It was kind of silly. It was so silly, the language, in terms of the syntax. I'd be laughing writing it because it was so stupid. I forget some of the examples. But you know what? We put out the app, worked great. People were loving it. It was good. Point is, I learned to become language, technology, agnostic. They're just tools. They're just tools. Don't fall in love with your tools. They're not religion. They're not your girlfriend. They're not your boyfriend. They're just tools. And the most important thing you want to take away from using all these tools is try to learn some universal principles from each of these tools. Try to learn what you can learn from them. So from Java, I learned about MVC in Java. I learned about Refactor. I learned most of my high-level, high-end, if you will, coding chops and principles in the Java community. That's where a lot of it was exposed through Java. So MVC pattern and other design patterns, factories and facade, and my favorite, of course, is just filters, and that's decorators filters, and but you can get something from all these languages. You can learn. I learned some interesting things, in terms of PHP, in terms of its simplicity and stuff at the time. But again, a lot of this is history. Nowadays, the languages, Python, Ruby, PHP, Java, C#, they're all neck and neck in terms of capabilities. If you're a good coder, you can make any of these languages and any of the frameworks that come with these languages work for you. So try not to get defensive about it when somebody says, hey, look, Ruby's going away, buddy. Slowly. It'll probably still be around 10 years from now, but its market shares seems to be fading. That's just the way it is. Ciao.